And now Iran's President Hassan Rouhani has called on the European Union to put pressure on state sponsors of terrorist groups in the Middle East to stop supporting them. Rouhani made the remarks in a meeting with the EU Foreign Policy Chief Federica Mogherini in her Tehran visit. He stressed the threat of terrorism is a global issue and not just limited to Syria and Iraq. The President also spoke of the nuclear deal between Iran and the P5+1 group of countries. Rouhani said that Iran is committed to the deal, also known as a Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, and expects the other side to abide by its obligations. Now, for her part, Mogherini said that EU needs Iran's help as a key power to resolve regional crises. EU official added European Union is determined to expand its economic ties with Tehran. Earlier, Mogherini held talks with Iran's Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif as well. And now we're joined by Mr. Tony Gosling, investigative journalist, joining us out of Bristol. Hello there, Mr. Gosling. Thanks for joining us on the program once again, sir. Now, Mr. Gosling, who do you believe the Iranian president is referring to in his repeated call for state-sponsored terrorism in the Middle East to be properly addressed?
Well, isn't it a shame when Mr. Rouhani has to refer to what is effectively a kind of primary school, very young children's type of lecture on terrorism, because terrorists are supposed to be non-state actors. That's at least how they're defined. But increasingly, states who can't legally use their own troops to invade countries to institute regime change have been using terrorists really ever since, I suppose, the Vietnam and Guatemala invasions of the United States and the backlash that they had back at home and in the Western world, discrediting them. They've started using terrorists, sponsoring terrorists around the world to do their dirty work for them. And this, I'm afraid, is what Federica Mogherini needs to know at the European Union. And maybe she does, maybe she doesn't. And I'm not sure, quite whether she is really understanding what the policies of the US and what the policies of, particularly obviously, of the European Union and the NATO countries really are in covertly sponsoring terrorism around the world. Remember, of course, that she is an unelected official of the European Union, even though she's there doing all the most important negotiations. Nobody is elected to her to that position. It's actually the Italian Prime Minister that sponsored her to do that job, so she's an appointee. Now, obviously, we'd be nice to see her making the right decisions here, but she certainly needs to understand how many countries, and usually this is through things like special forces of the various nations' armed forces. These are used because they don't come under proper parliamentary scrutiny around the European countries. They're often used to infiltrate countries, and also they are being used right now, the British Armed Force, Special Forces, for example, to train terrorists in Syria.
And Rouhani also mentioned that the threat of terrorism is not just confined to Iraq and Syria. Obviously, I mean, we're seeing this unprecedented reach of terrorists throughout the world these days, not just in attacks, but also in recruitment. Your take on that?
Well, I can tell you ISIS recruits are coming through Turkey. And the Canadian intelligence, the Turkish police, have released that Khadija Sultana, who was a 16-year-old school child from London, she was actually smuggled through by a Canadian intelligence agent who was a former Syrian colonel through Turkey down into Syria, where she subsequently, a few weeks ago, was pronounced dead. Now, this is the recruitment being done by Western intelligence services and the training often done by Western special forces. So if you're going to address terrorism, you first of all got to stop Western countries, so-called democratic countries, covertly funding and helping these people. The terrorist groups in Syria, I mean, there are so many of them. And I think also we need to understand who's really setting this policy behind the scenes. It certainly is not the High Representative Federica Mogherini, although she is a conduit and is a very important person to get on side. It's big organisations, lobbying organisations, where the arms companies are very strong, like the Council on Foreign Relations, the US business elite lobby for foreign policy, who have many people say more money and more clout than the State Department have. Their motto, the Council on Foreign Relations, is "We are everywhere." UBK. Of course, they love using these classical Roman Empire time epithets, but the CFR are one of the most important policy-making organisations, and I'm afraid Federica Mogherini, however important she may feel she is, she's actually dancing to their tune most of the time, and the more people that realise that, the better.
It just seems that if the world does not unite to address this problem, it's going to haunt all of us for the next 40, 50 years, or maybe even longer. Thank you for your input, Mr. Tony Gosling, once again joining us here with his valuable contribution, investigative journalist out of Bristol.